So hello everyone, very warm welcome to this IHL talk, which is entitled, as you probably know, hopefully you're not here by mistake or by accident. It's entitled Hidden Horrors of Armed Conflict, Missing and Forcibly Disappeared Migrants. We will be speaking about migrants actually in broader context, so not only in the context of armed conflict. But I really have to say I'm super excited because it's the last IHL talk of this semester. And for the ones who know me, you know that this is a topic that is very close to my heart. As usually, I forgot to introduce myself. That tends to happen, or I forget to introduce either myself or my co-moderator. Luckily today I don't have a co-moderator, so that concern is out. But I also think everyone here, probably most of you I know. So my name is Anna Sorvin-Coralli. I'm a teaching assistant at the Geneva Academy, and I'm a PhD candidate at the Geneva Graduate Institute. I should start the other way around, saying first I'm a PhD candidate. I always do this mistake, that I first say I'm a teaching assistant, but maybe next year. It's still not everything lost, I guess. And I really want to again stress how excited I am that I have here in the room with me. So first, Gabriela Citroni. Many of you know her because she's giving the course on enforced disappearances at the Geneva Academy. Gabriela is also adjunct professor at the University Milano Bicocca. Did I pronounce this correct, Gabriela? Perfect, I was practicing. And she's also senior legal advisor for Trine International. And finally, she's also the member of the UN Working Group on Enforced or Involuntary Disappearances. Then I have next to me Grażyna Baranuska. So Grażyna, she is a postdoctoral fellow at the Hertie School in Berlin. She's also assistant professor at the Polish Academy Science, or Polish Science of Academy, I never know. I was trying to remember, somehow it didn't happen. And she's also a member of the working group on enforced or involuntary disappearances. So we have two members of the working group here. And finally, we have also Florian, who is in Belgrade. Florian von Kunig, he's from the International Committee of the Red Cross. He's currently the global advocacy lead of the Central Tracing Agency. And before that, he was the deputy head of the Missing Persons Project at the ICRC, which lasted between 2018 and 2022. So thank you so much for being here today. So, I mean, as said, and I think as we all know, migrants nowadays, they disappeared or go missing, right, for different reasons. Sometimes it's an armed conflict, sometimes they flee due to armed conflict, sometimes they flee due to, let's say, climate changes, due to political violence, due to economic crisis. And really because they're oftentimes forced to take illegal paths, either because they are afraid to encounter with authorities or because they just don't know where to go. They are very oftentimes exposed to different forms of violence, including sometimes something that we call enforced disappearance, which can be defined, I'm sure the experts in the room will tell you, but really as situations where you have a deprivation of liberty in any form, which is followed then by the refusal to share information on the fate or whereabouts of this person, or concealment of the fate or whereabouts. And this is just one, of course, of the situations. They also can go missing because of the reasons that we don't know, or sometimes they can be disappeared, for instance, by different non-state actors. Now, in all these situations, who really suffer most is the family. And I want to ask, maybe first you, Grażyna, if you could maybe tell us, what does actually family do in such situation from your experience, from your work? How does the search look like? And do families encounter any special challenges just because their relative was a migrant?
So thank you. And as I was asked not to prepare, I really did not prepare. So if I'm really talk too much, just stop me on that. It's a big question because generally the whole fight against enforced disappearances is driven by families. And we know from researching enforced disappearances how difficult it is for families to keep on their lives while their loved ones are disappeared. They do not know what has happened. They keep searching for the person while also needing to keep going on with their lives. And this is often in a situation of political violence and general fear of the state. And then we have this situation which we euphemistically call today very often missing migrants. So, which I think is often used also to take away the horror that we would usually accompany with the word enforced disappearances. So if somebody's disappeared, this is like more of a horror. And then, but the missing migrants' families, from what we know, experience exactly the same feelings, the same distress, the plight to need to find them. But this is heartened by the difficulties of the possible irregular status and the cross-border effect. So one example that I would like to mention are families in Honduras. And we were just recently, a couple of weeks ago, with the working group on enforced disappearances on a country visit in Honduras. And we specifically met with families of missing migrants, as well as with state officials that also told us about how the state tries to support them. And basically, when the families find out that their loved ones is disappeared, often it's in a way that they stop responding to phone calls. So it's not that they are informed, oh, the person is missing. It's just 10 hours, 15 hours, 20 hours, no phone contact. So what they then start to do, usually they find out that there are committees within Honduras of families of missing persons, and they reach out to them. Some of them might reach out to police officers in Honduras, which is really difficult because usually they would not accept those claims. Then they try, in the very first beginning, to contact people in Mexico. Most of them disappear in Mexico. Sometimes the families don't even know in which country exactly the person disappeared, because the last time they had contact was when the person tried to regular cross a border. So it's like they might be here or here, so they do not even know which consulate to contact to do that. And after the first couple of days, they usually have some information. So they might have been contacted, and that we've heard from many families in Honduras, by people that try to extort money from them. So either the Hondurans have been actually kidnapped in Mexico, or they have not been kidnapped, by somebody heard that they are looking for a loved one and contacts them saying, oh, I do have information about your loved one if you send me money. So this is also like making this search much harder. And then if it really turns out that the person has disappeared or was last seen in Mexico, then they try to apply for something that is called a humanitarian visa, where they can travel to Mexico to conduct part of the search themselves. And apparently, practically, it's really difficult to get the humanitarian visa, and in the end, most families actually travel on tourist visas and not on humanitarian visas. But they need to have the money also to do that. It's really a long travel. And over there, then, they're also in a country where police might not work as well as we would like to do. So they really try to do those efforts then by themselves. They need to bribe people to get any information about what has happened to the loved ones. And some of them might be forcibly disappeared by the state. Some might be disappeared by drug cartels, trafficked. We met also families whose loved ones reappeared in detention centers that were not able to contact them for days and days to go on. So this is really a situation that plays on, and at least those people from Honduras are practically able to go to Mexico. This is very different from those that die in the Mediterranean, because their family members usually are not able to come anywhere close to where the deaths have occurred, possible deaths, because it might be something else. It might be trafficking, slavery work. So it's really a difficult kind of this plight that we see, and also the support that they can receive. And this is also one of the reasons why it's so important to address that internationally, because it's not a national problem on our country. It needs to be connected between different countries. So I think I will stop now.
Just maybe a follow-up question, Grażyna. And did you feel now, upon your visit in Honduras, for instance, I don't know, the families that you met, but that they were more knowledgeable about how to search if you compare it to some other contexts that you maybe previously worked with? How did you feel about this?
So personally, I think that a lot of searches are different. So even if there is some know-how on searching, for example, on exhumations, which is the fact kind of in Mexico, that we know when there are mass graves, then families very often physically themselves look for those people. So this is something that there is know-how and they exchange it. But then if the person might not be dead, the person might be trafficked. And for that you need to have other know-how and other knowledgeable information. So I'm not really sure I would say that they're more knowledgeable. I think for certain situations they do have know-how. So in particular, a number of families we met were family relatives of people that were massacred. There were a couple of major massacres in Mexico where migrants were killed. However, I do think that one of the reasons that those people came to meet with us is that they have an answer to their search. And also those massacres received a lot of international attention. There was money to do the investigation, at least part of it. So because of that, they're also more involved and more aware. So I'm sure that there are families in Honduras that have loved ones that have disappeared, but they do not know how to search for them, either in Mexico or in Honduras. We've also met with Honduran families who are afraid of conduct their search for their loved ones in the country itself. So well, I do think, well, one thing that is clear is that those that have more money and more education usually also have better access to search mechanism. So it's, I mean, there's really a lot of information, especially in the internet, and specifically for families and specifically in Spanish. I think that, for example, Arab-speaking families are in a much more difficult situation for that. But the guidelines for Spanish-speaking families are really well available and accessible, as long as somebody really knows how to use the internet, right? Reads well, and has access to all of those things. And this is things that we take as a given here at the Geneva Academy, but it's not a given thing.
Perfect, thank you. And as I see Gabriela dancing, I wonder whether she wants to add something. Also, yes.
Sorry. No, it's just to, I don't know, it's not that I disagree, but I do think that a major difference is precisely in something that you somehow took for granted just because you came back from Honduras right now, is the existence of family committees. Which in most countries you don't have. The very fact that you don't have an association that is dealing with that specific topic makes you lost, even more so. In Honduras, El Salvador, Mexico, Nicaragua, for instance, is different. You do have Nicaraguans who go missing as well or are victims of enforced disappearance, but you don't have a local committee of relatives, which makes it for families, literally, where do I start with? What do I do? Who do I turn to? In most countries, you don't have a committee to turn to. And here, maybe Florian, and I'm volunteering you to jump in, but we had a meeting where the idea was literally to try also to map this and see in other continents where there are committees of families of missing. That was broader, not necessarily disappeared. And to be honest, if we just stick to the mapping exercise, that was a bit depressing because you do have an area of the world where you do have a lot with limitations, and there I do fully agree, but you do have areas of the world where many migrants are coming from that are off the radar altogether. So if I'm a relative there, it's a no-go, literally. Who do I turn to? Let aside the internet, and on top you are much more exposed to reprisals, harassment, risks, because you are completely alone. So there I do see a complete difference that doesn't make necessarily more effective because the difficulties that they are facing are the same. One thing, since I have the mic now and that's my turn, no, sorry. It's just maybe a couple of general things. I liked very much that we started with a reference to the families, because I have to say there is something that always drives me crazy. In some existing projects or programs dealing with missing migrants, the focus is on numbers, fair enough, of the missing migrant, but there is no mention of those left behind. So they are even more invisible than those who disappeared. And there is no figure of that. And this honestly holds true both for enforced disappearance and the missing more in general. Those who know me know my metaphor, but I will do this again. It's like when you throw a rock into the water and you do have ripple effects. Counting only the rock and when it hit the water really makes it invisible, all the rest of the ripples, families that are involved, and they are not counted. And this goes hands in hands with another thing that I would really like to have off the table, and that was already mentioned by Repetita Juvent. In many projects, missing migrants is equal to dead migrants. No, they might be dead, but missing means that they are missing. They might be alive, and therefore they might be victims of trafficking. They might be held in even mental facilities. There are a range of possibilities. Counting only the dead and dealing with disappeared or missing as if they were all dead is honestly untrue and hugely re-traumatizing precisely for those families. So I would really like to keep that off the table. And with this.
So Florian, Gabriela gives you the word.
I mean, I have to say I agree with pretty much everything that was just said, and you actually said most of the things that I would have brought up. In particular, also your last point, Gabriela, on missing migrants being alive, many of them. But just, I mean, to come back to your initial questions, I think a big aspect is also what the status of the family is, where the family is, not only geographically, but if the family is in a country of origin, or if the family themselves are migrants, for example. So even if you're in a country of origin already, if you're in Honduras, as Grazina just said, it's very, very difficult, but you're probably in the part of the world that has, in many ways, the most developed, environment in which people are looking. There's at least some things you can do. If you are a family in Pakistan and, as Grazina said, you don't even know where, somewhere between, I don't know, Iran, Turkey, Greece, or the Balkans, your relative disappeared, then it's a completely, again, different order of magnitude in terms of the complication of the search. And there are options. I mean, there is, for example, the Red Cross, Red Crescent Worldwide Family Links Network. So, we have, I think, 192 national societies, and they're linked up, and we can look, we can try to reestablish family contacts, for example, with an Afghan migrant who is somewhere in Europe and has lost contact with their family, which means that person is missing for the family. But even those possibilities are very limited and can only help to resolve a fraction of the cases. And as soon as you get into people who have died, then you really need to also have state institutions who work on this, because to recover, examine and properly identify a deceased migrants, that's no longer something that you can do through informal channels or just with the help of NGOs. The other scenario, and I just wanted to touch on this, is of course if families themselves are migrants, and it becomes very difficult because they're often have irregular migration status, whether they're in a country of transit or in a country of destination. And that adds another layer of problems. For example, if you're, let's say, in the UK, those are cases that we know, and you think that your son, who was trying to come from, let's say, Ethiopia to Greece and then onwards to Europe, has disappeared in a shipwreck. The usual way to go would be to go to authorities in the UK and say, we think our son is missing, maybe even in a particular event. Could you inquire with Greek authorities and we're happy to provide information as needed. But just that act of registering that case might put you at risk. Yeah. So there's this whole added layer if families are migrants. Then ultimately, as I was just saying, it's yeah, there's informal channels, they're very important. There is NGOs, there's the Red Cross, but in the end, to have a really effective way of searching for migrants and of searching for migrants at a meaningful scale, you really need to mobilize governments. And that's really the most difficult, the tricky part here that we're discussing.
Thank you, Florian. And you brought me to my next question, which are, so you were speaking about the families, now you finish with the governments, I need to engage governments. Now I want to switch, I want to take you then to examples of countries where the governments have engaged and they created, or also partially by triggered, or let's say by the support of different actors in the state, different search mechanisms, which we referred to them a couple of times already here. For instance, such as the search mechanism basically for all the disappeared and missing, and I'm speaking now, quite some of them exist, for instance, in Latin America. Do this mechanism help, I wonder, to be more efficient? And specifically, I'm interested also, like, does it help to have a special, if you like, task force for missing and disappeared migrants? Now, maybe you've heard also that quite recently the Secretary General referred in his call, apologies, to the need to establish new mechanism for the missing in Syria. Let's imagine that, I don't know how many years this mechanism is thinking whether it would make sense to establish a special task force for migrants looking at different examples of other countries. Would this be helpful? Could you start this time, Florian?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I'm not sure if all listeners are familiar with the concept of a mechanism, but when we talk about a missing person mechanism, it's kind of the sum of all institutional efforts, usually in a country, to clarify the fate and whereabouts and investigate cases of persons going missing. And that can take the form simply of coordinating the work of different state institutions. There might be a little committee that coordinates all this, or it could be in particular in countries where caseloads really exceed the capacity of regular institutions, then you see the creation of dedicated institutions. So you have, for example, the Search Commission in Mexico that is really a dedicated mechanism, and you have a lot of examples in other countries. In many cases, these are limited in mandate and in time, for example, to conflict victims, in Bosnia, the victims of the 1990s war, in Colombia, the civil war. So there is often limitations to what mechanisms can do by mandate. What has to be said is that a lot of these mechanisms, they really have critical capacities that are relevant to migrants as well. Yeah, they collect the information, they centralize information at national level, they have forensic capacities, they have investigative and search capacities. So all these are critical capacities. The added complication of migrant cases is the transnational dimension, and that's usually, not in all cases, Mexico is an exception, but beyond the scope of many mechanisms. So I think, yeah, the first part to your question is these mechanisms really have critical expertise and resources that are relevant to migrant cases as well, but often their mandates would limit them from dealing with such cases. Now, there are a lot of countries in the world where you have overlapping caseloads. Yeah. So if you look at Cote d'Ivoire, if you look at Nigeria, you have mixtures of historic conflict situations, ongoing situations of violence, and added to this, migration cases. And Syria is a little bit a similar example where you have a conflict, but one result of the conflict is large numbers of people leaving the country, fleeing the conflict, and they actually disappear while fleeing the country. And so bringing up the Syria example, and this would also apply to other situations that I just mentioned, there is a lot of arguments to be had about the need to ensure that a mechanism like this can also cover caseloads of people that have disappeared in migration, especially in the Syrian context. I'm pretty certain a lot of family don't conclusively know at what point and where their family members disappeared. I would also add, and that's particularly interesting to Syria, that vast numbers, and we're talking literally, millions of families, or more than 1 million of families, are actually abroad. So already there is a transnational component, because any mechanism for Syria will have to be able to reach out into many different countries and liaise with and obtain information from families. And so it in my personal view, it would the situation dictates that any future mechanism in Syria would need to have to include cases of Syrians who disappeared in migration. I'll stop there.
And if I can challenge you a little bit, or if I can dare to ask, no, I'm not going to challenge you, but if I ask you of one example of good practice, would you dare to pinpoint to one mechanism that you would say, this is the mechanism that the Syrians would follow, and why, if so? I see Gabriela.
No, maybe I would, again, give a step backwards in the sense that I fully agree with Florian in thinking that where these mechanisms have been established, most of them would have the resources, the means, and the capacity to also look into this particular issue, However, to my knowledge, none of them has been designed having this in mind, which means that at the end of the day, if I think even Mexico, they do have the mandate, but the main search commission in Mexico, when it comes to dealing with the migrants, is where you do have more problems because then all the obstacles that she mentioned kick in, and therefore they would say, okay, we already have more than 115,000 cases of non-migrants disappeared. It's already complicated. It's more or less forced that they focus on this. Syria is no exception. To my understanding, and I fully agree that a mechanism should really look into this as well, but for what has been discussed so far, if this mechanism is established, they will most likely, unless it is designed beforehand, having this in mind and saying, okay, we do have to design this to collect also cases and to detect also cases and to make access to the mechanism easy for families that are not living in Syria or that can understand what is the mandate, they are going to focus on cases within Syria that are already thousands, hundreds of thousands. So it's also a practical problem. Now, I do have a good, a good example, but that's a slightly different mechanism that relates to something that Grażyna was mentioning earlier. And Florian knows where I'm going with this. It's a mixed mechanism that was established in Mexico, but including representative of associations of these missing migrants and disappeared migrants from Central America. That was established with the agreement of the government, civil society organizations, and let's say family associations. But that was designed since the very beginning to work on the missing migrants in the context of the 3 massacres she was mentioning. So the focus was very specific, but the design, the idea, the kind of network that was put in place, the fact that it had to take on board different stakeholders, for me, that's the way to go if you want to have a functioning mechanism dealing with the issue of migrants. And you will have to try to design in advance channels that are effective, because you can even design the perfect mechanism, but if at the end of the day families cannot have access to this, and if, and I don't want to open Pandora's box, you don't design wisely the whole idea of how to share information, this is not going to work, because imagine in countries in Central America and Mexico, they speak the same language, so there is no language barrier, but they have problems in sharing and crossing information among countries. Imagine when you have 3 countries where you speak 3 different languages. If you don't think this ahead, this is going to crash into a wall.
Can I jump in? Okay. There are two topics that I wanted to speak with that I thought really interesting in what you mentioned. So the first is an example of a mechanism that is one of the longest existing missing persons mechanism that specifically does not cover migrants, which is the Missing Persons Commission in Cyprus, which was established for disappearances that happened in the 60s and 70s, and I think the academically fascinating, interesting thing and humanely really bad thing is that one of the reasons migrants are disappearing now, or the ways that are disappearing now, is that in the Republic of Cyprus, when migrants, even if they're regular, disappear, very often the police said, well, they just fled to the north to avoid taxes, whatever, and since they have no contact to the north, they do not do anything about it. So kind of the very reason why they do not do the investigations or the search is exactly the same reason why the commission was put up. So the conflict dividing the island, but still the huge mechanism that gets a lot of money and does a lot of effort, concentrates only on those that disappeared in the 60s and 70s, and that is actually not criticized on Cyprus. So this is kind of, so in that sense, I totally agree with that you cannot like take something out, and the mechanism would need to address migrants. However, and this is my second point, I think in particular when we know that migrants have disappeared in the European Union, that all the countries of the European Union have a bigger capacity than Syria has, then I do think that the responsibility should be on the European states, and that's how we should try to frame it, and not on the mechanism in Syria that has, even if it gets huge capacities, but it has lots and lots of challenges. So I think even for Syrians that disappear in Greece or in Turkey, it's really those countries that we should pinpoint, because those are the ones that have the capacities and possibilities. And to make that very personal and practical, there is a case currently at the Human Rights Committee of a person, and that also speaks to one of your first comments on the irregular status and the problems. So there was a Syrian man in Germany who got refugee status. So he had a regular status in Germany. He was allowed to travel within the EU. So he traveled with his card. And his brother, who was in Turkey, also a Syrian refugee, tried to reach Greece, and the last time they had contact with him, I think, was from the boat. So then they assumed he disappeared in Greece. So as he had regular status, he took his papers, he flew to Greece to look for his brother. But due to racial profiling, he was sent back to Turkey, and his papers were taken away from him. So this case, he tried to access again, proving that he has actually legal rights to stay in Greece, which he has. And this case is now at the Human Rights Committee. But what I think is, what makes that case also fascinating is that it shows that even the regular status that a person has, if we talk about all the problems that irregular migrants or person perceived as irregular migrants have, makes it so much more difficult to search for their loved ones. So we have, in fact, in this case, 2 disappeared persons, right? We have the younger brother and the older one for some time. And as far as I know, the case to the Human Rights Committee is actually only about the older one, because it's so hard to bring cases for the younger one where you have no proof whatsoever where he arrived and how he disappeared. So kind of in the end, we bring to the treaty bodies only the case that in sense is less severe, because the person reappeared, he's alive. And for the more severe case, for the very likely death of the younger person, there's nothing that so far can be done. So I think it's really like this, I think this, for me, this case really shows many problematic issues that we have in that context, but also that the one state that could have done something about it is Greece, So, right, it could have searched for the young person in the beginning, and maybe it would be fine, maybe not. We don't know. That's the thing with disappearances. But no search was conducted or investigation in that case.
Perfect. And Grażyna, without knowing, you said my word, you said responsibility. Everyone who knows me, my students, they know I love this word. So I want to take you a little bit to this question where you mentioned, for instance, you have some maybe clear example where you say whose responsibility, namely, let's say various European states, you would search. But let's think of examples where you would have migrants, for instance, such as in Mexico or I don't know, in Nigeria, and you would have non-state armed groups, such as, I think, Las Zetas, if my memory still serves, yes? I'm so glad I always have help on the side, so I don't have to think. Or Boko Haram or in Nigeria, where you would have, for instance, situations where a migrant would missing and disappeared. It seems, or allegedly, this disappearance is somehow linked to this certain non-state actor. What are really the chances there to establish accountability of different stakeholders, even if possible? Do you maybe wish to start? You can, Gabriela, do you give the word to?
I see that you are pushing me towards this because I'm second only to Anna fancying the word responsibility. And here I would say, and we have to go back to something. First of all, we do have to keep on the table two different kinds of responsibility. State responsibility and individual responsibility. And they work on a different level. They are, of course, intertwined, but we first, and I would first like to go with state responsibility. Even when you do have non-state actors involved, states still hold responsibility when it comes to missing or disappeared in terms of at least searching and at least launching investigations and hopefully where it's possible to hold accountable individuals involved. So there I would still go back to this. And in certain cases, if you give the example of Mexico, which I know better than Nigeria, but I guess it's the same to an extent. In some cases, you just know the fact. The person is missing or is disappeared. But it's unclear who is involved in the disappearance. So who would be the main responsible to try to investigate and provide an answer? And until you don't have this I would still call it a disappearance, even an enforced one, if I don't know for sure that non-state actors are involved, the state. So I would go back to this. Then moving away from clear-cut ideas, and well, if we are talking migrants, we could enlarge the scope of responsibility. In some cases, they might not be directly involved in the disappearance, but where you were mentioning certain policies. I mean, if a person goes missing or dies because my policy is to close the border and they decide to pick a much more dangerous path, then I do think that there is a certain level of state responsibility. But we might wish to discuss this. With non-state actors, I first would say that we do have to maybe try to distinguish which non-state actors are we talking about. I do think that there are differences if we think of groups that do have a certain amount of control over territory or population. A different thing would be criminal organizations, traffickers, or even private individuals involved. Because non-state actors is this big box where we can put anything and everything. So there I do think that, at least at the international level, we have some more responses, and I don't know if we would call them enforced disappearances or acts tantamount to enforce disappearances. That is a very legalistic thing, but where we would still say the fact is very similar, but what you are responsible with is that I can have at least some level of accountability and discussion more on the humanitarian part. But then this leads to the criminal aspect of this, because accountability is also holding them accountable. Again, back to the state. It's the state that should first investigate and hold them accountable. And maybe this would become, or this could become broader when we think of states instead of state. I mean, universal jurisdiction. You do have other states that might be held or that might have to conduct prosecutions for acts tantamount to enforced disappearances attributed to non-state actors or to state actors, but that would trigger huge difficulties when migrants are involved all the more because of the transnational aspects, how to secure mutual legal assistance, but I wouldn't exclude this. The thing, just on top of my mind, I can think if we stick to criminal responsibility, individual criminal responsibility, I can think of a few cases where state agents have been prosecuted for allegations of being involved in disappearances of migrants. I can't think of cases where non-state actors have been prosecuted for this, because those cases, to my knowledge, rather would go under trafficking, I mean, different kind of crimes. Enough to start?
Yes. Do you want to add something, Grażyna, on this specifically, or no? Can I ask? I was thinking whether I should ask, or everyone will leave this event frustrated, never come back. But what is the rate of judgments? How many judgments we usually have? Gabriela, could you tell us, is this a thing happens every day? We have one judgment for enforced disappearance, or every second day, or once per week? What is the impunity rate for that?
Do we have time? This is going to... No, it's unfortunately very low, but there are a number of problems. First of all, to qualify and to have a judgment on a case of enforced disappearance, you do need to have the crime of enforced disappearance codified as such at the domestic level, which is not the case in most of the countries in the world. So there might be cases that do entail and do concern enforced disappearances, but are not prosecuted as such. Even when they are prosecuted as such, enforced disappearance, the way it is codified in some countries, is codified placing a very, very high burden on prosecution, and therefore they would rather go for other crimes. So if you ask me for numbers, they are embarrassingly low. Not necessarily because there is total impunity, and I would say the situation varies also from region to region. Enforced disappearance, if we just stick to enforced disappearance as such, is by nature a crime that is shrouded in secrecy, which makes the work of prosecutors hell, literally, because you do have to find witnesses, you do have to gather evidences, and per se is one of the most difficult crimes to prosecute. So for me, this is one of the reasons where the rate of success is very low. We were just having, I'm not disclosing any confidential information, but having a discussion today within the working group, and we cover the whole world. In some regions of the world, there are cases that are clear-cut enforced disappearances, but they are not called as such by the families themselves, and even less so by the prosecutor, by lawyers, by judges. So there you might have some judgments, but again, they would be off the radar. So I just think you have to take into account some practical difficulties that make pursuing justice very, very difficult. Now, and I'm going to put it much more complicated for her. No, in the sense that even when in a country, and this goes to both of them, that's a nationality thing, where you finally do have, no, because it's quoted as one of the best examples of trials, and it involves Syria, enforced disappearance, and Germany. So it's a tale. That's the point. So there was a big universal jurisdiction case that involved a Syrian, and that was carried out in Germany. In the case, enforced disappearance was actually very much on the table, but eventually it was off the radar because there were, as far as I understand, technical difficulties in qualifying it as such, requirements that were invented by the prosecution that are not actually written. So that might also be part of the problem.
Thank you. Yeah, so this is actually a really interesting case. If you want to look into that, it's a Koblenz court case in Germany, and I think it was not even last year. It was 2 years ago, right? It was already some time ago, and it concerned a state official that was, among others, responsible for really huge numbers of enforced disappearances. And this is also a problem that Germany has not included in its penal code, the crime of enforced disappearances, but that was not the only problem. I mean, it could still have happened, and it was a number of different decisions made on the way that led to the fact that the judgment, which was not bad, did not include, in the end, enforced disappearances, which, looking at the scale of enforced disappearances happened in Syria, is actually a big problem, kind of because it does not recognize that this is really a human rights violation that is taking place widespread in Syria. And I think this is really connected to, and I will shortly only speak about enforced disappearances. This is really something that is not only the case for this very famous and important case with regard to Syria, but it really happens in many places, and especially with criminal cases. So when I did research on the Western Balkans, and a number of cases that in regional courts were addressed as enforced disappearances or as missing cases, once they reached the ICTY, they were qualified differently. So the persons were convicted for murder, for example. So would have the family bringing a case to a body in Kosovo as a missing person, while the ICTY would convict the person for murder of this person. So, and there are many reasons why this is happening. One of them being that human rights requires different, like the human rights law requires different ways of proving compared to especially international criminal law, but the same holds true for domestic criminal cases. So I think this is something that in that sense is actually easier to hold the state responsible for enforced disappearance than a person within the state. So this is really something that is possible. I mean, Argentina is one of those countries that where many persons have been actually convicted for enforced disappearances, right?
30 years after the event.
But still, I mean, this is still happening. In most cases, 30 years after the disappearances, you still don't have any convictions. So I think this is a possibility, but it's very difficult and it requires a number of issues. It's also families that would need this case to want to be called an enforced disappearance. And this is all. And we talked both with Gabriela really long and widely and sketching difficulties for enforced disappearances. That is a clearly defined crime, which is clear responsibility of states and of actors. And then we come to missing migrants, where we do not have always a clearly defined crime. So we might argue that forcing somebody to take a difficult route raises responsibility. We discuss different forms of pushbacks, of making areas of the country impossible to provide humanitarian aid for, and so on. But this is all, like, conceptual, is not as clear as enforced disappearances. So there might be arguments in both ways. So for crimes committed for disappearances of migrants, there's even much less convictions, because it's also legally so much more difficult to bring somebody to justice for committing crimes concerning disappearances on migrants. And they're also kind of accepted. So it feels like in Europe we have accepted that people are dying trying to reach Europe. It does not raise our horror every day that we hear that people are dying trying to reach, and we do not treat it generally as a human rights violation. We have this concept that this is a tragedy. We might argue, if we are more on the right side, that it was their choice to take that way. If we are more on the left side, we might argue they were forced to do that. But generally, it's very often on this context of just the tragedy that has happened. So in that case, the responsibility both on the states that might cause that and on the individuals that conduct those practices is much more difficult to establish.
So in case you still don't know what would you like to do in your career, I think there's a clearly high need for prosecutors of enforced disappearances of migrants specifically. Right? I think so. I always say this is what I'll do if I dare to, because as you said, unfortunately, the definitions are mostly envisioned or understood in a way in criminal law that it's really hard to prove them. Now, because we completely dominated here, Florian, I want to give you the floor as well, but I want to ask you something different. I want to ask you about the policies that you think are helpful for migrants, specifically to address the issue of missing and forcibly disappeared migrants, that can be designed by organizations such as the International Committee of the Red Cross, or even regional organizations such as, for instance, the African Union. And I'm really interested whether you think it helps to create special policies for missing migrants, or this can create also, or can result in any dangers, if you like, whenever you focus too much on specific policies. I'm already giving you a hint of going in one direction, I think. But if you could share a little bit on this would be great.
Yeah, no, thanks. That's a broad question. I mean, first, I think I need to distinguish the role of an organization like the ICRC from the role of intergovernmental regional organizations in particular. Yeah, so I mean, we are a body that has a lot of technical and policy advice to give. We sensitize, we mobilize, but the policies that need to be adopted and implemented, I mean, the people that need to adopt and implement policies, that is then really states, and here you're talking about through regional fora, regional organizations in particular. And the obvious link here is that an effective response to migratory routes, to missing migrants, needs to be route-based. Because this is what we're dealing with. It's missing migrants. Migrants go missing along a route, and so what you need is countries of origin, countries of transit, and destination that somehow need to work to commonly accepted objectives and cooperate. So that, I think, is what is needed. I think your question whether or not this is important and it can do damage to the issue, I'm not sure I understand the question, because I think it's such a specific problem that cannot be you can't address it at a national level. By definition, it's a transnational challenge, and so you need specific policies that allow countries to cooperate in doing this. So what this concretely means is, I would say, three layers, so to say. You have prevention, the prevention aspect, you have the case resolution, the search aspect, and you have the question of dealing, how do you address the needs of families. And it's probably too long today to get into a lot of details here, but I think at the level of prevention, there's a lot to be said about countries reviewing the very policies that Grazina and others just mentioned that contribute to migrants going missing. Obviously, that is primarily often a national question, but then if you look at the European Union, for example, it becomes very much a regional issue. That's the first thing. The second thing of cooperation across borders. This is, I think, quite a unique challenge to missing migrants. I won't deny there are existing frameworks for similar cooperation. There are Interpol channels through which police forces exchange information. There is amazing international cooperation when it comes to security measures, to border control measures. There are networks connecting in real time countries in West Africa with international terrorism, anti-fly lists, etc. So you have a lot of structures that all exist. but they're not being used for missing migrants. There's good reasons why they shouldn't be used for missing migrants, because there's huge data protection sensitivities that we didn't really get to today. That all being said, I think you need specific policies for missing migrants, and there is a lot of examples in Africa. The African Commission on Human and People's Rights has passed a resolution which hopefully is the foundation for the African Union and perhaps organizations such as ECOWAS to take on greater roles. And you have a lot of other examples in the Americas, the Regional Conference on Migration, the Rabat process, which is a Euro-African migration dialogue that last year decided to actually inscribe the issue of missing migrants into their mandate. So there's a lot of work to be done to mobilize these organizations to use the cooperation frameworks that they have to address this issue.
Perfect, thank you. And you know, I did the mistake that I always tell the others not to do. No, you remember my mind map. I cannot read your mind. Here I thought Florian will read my mind. So just to tell you what I was thinking of, and I think with this we can start a Q&A, but I was really thinking more of situations when the countries focus too much. Basically, they say we will adopt special policies for the people, let's say, yes, not to migrate or not to go missing, but they don't address the roots of the reasons why the people on the first place even migrate, or they, for instance, adopt stricter policies to cross the borders because they say this will prevent eventually, luckily, hopefully, this is what I meant, the people to go missing or disappear, but then clearly, very often the migrants will be inclined to go take even more dangerous paths. So this is somehow what I thought by
Okay,
this,
I mean, I will very quickly
yeah.
reply to this.
Yeah.
I mean, this is something we have observed. You have the Global Compact on Migration. That's arguably certainly the most detailed and among the most important international global political commitments to deal with this issue. It has an Objective 8, which is on saving lives and transnational cooperation on missing migrants. And that sets out really a lot of measures that the 164 or so countries who voted for this in the General Assembly, in a way, have pledged to implement. And what happened over the last 2 years, so 2022 mostly, was regional reviews of what have countries actually done to implement this. The first problem is that Objective 8 is among the least implemented objectives. But then if you actually looked into what countries were reporting, that's what you just touched on. A lot of countries were reporting, well, we worked on Objective 8 on missing migrants by, doubling the number of patrols that our Navy has undertaken in coastal waters, or we have really stepped up the fight against human trafficking. And that is ultimately, this is a real misunderstanding, because these measures in themselves, they tend to have the precisely the opposite effect often, which is to make migration routes ever more dangerous, because you don't stop migration with these measures, you tend to reorient it to the next dangerous kind of route. Yeah? So this is something important. It's something that we and other organizations try to correct, which is this assumption that greater security-focused approaches will ultimately help you to address this issue. They won't, and there's really statistics to undermine this.
Thank you, Florian. And just, I think it's time to open the Q&As. I was just checking if Milica will connect, because I was told maybe one of the committee on Enforced Disappearance members will connect, but just because I forgot to mention at the beginning that the Committee on Enforced Disappearances is currently also working on this issue of migrants, and they adopted the first draft on migration, I think just a month ago or something like this, and I think I shared it with the LLM students at least, or I already forgot what I share with you, what I don't know. Then I will share with you the link. I did the one on non-state actors, the statement, yes, apologies. Okay, yes.
No, because there is a difference. The one on non-state actors, they just adopted it, so it's for your own culture. But the draft is now open for contributions. So they open a call for inputs that is open until the 15th of June, and therefore you can submit comments to the draft, which has been published at the end of March. One thing, as you know now, I have the mic and I will keep it. No. No. It's just because I'm older and I know that if I don't say things as soon as I think of them, then I will forget. But it's something that really resonated with me in what Florian was describing. As some of you know, others will soon learn, over the past maybe 2 years, the working group itself has been working on something that might sound completely unrelated, that is a study on new technologies and enforced disappearance. Now, one of the issues where we've seen this dual potential and risks and the policies that states and even regional organizations do adopt is precisely on how regional organizations and states are putting a huge amount of money on new technologies in migration, but only the security aspect. And they forget, quite conveniently, that that new technology could be used to locate them, to prevent them from going missing, and to stop or to provide an immediate answer. I'm fully aware that there are tricky aspects because of data protection, because of if you use profiling, then this might be problematic, but it's a clear-cut example of the policy conceived and designed in the right way could make a huge difference. You have all the means on the spot, but they are used quite the other way around. So it's just something I wanted to mention before forgetting.
Perfect. I think we'll open the floor now to Q&As. Okay? Yes?
Thank you very much. So I actually came here by accident. I was looking at Villa Monnier for an event that I'm hosting later in the year, and I had a tour, and I actually saw the flyer, and I thought this was very interesting, so I'm staying. So my question is, you referenced a lot non-state actors, which is a very broad label, and one kind of subcategory of non-state actors to me would be the private sector. What role would you see, or what amount of responsibility could be essentially handed responsibly to the private sector to reduce the number of missing migrants? And it's a very abstract question. So I was thinking, for example, there's a big crisis of commercial seafarers not conducting search and rescue operations at sea. A lot of people who move irregularly also work irregularly to the knowledge of their employees. A lot of transport carriers, for example, airlines, shipping companies, have access to information that could ultimately be used. And to touch on Florian's important point, how do we also kind of make sure that the data is used responsibly and ethically?
Is the question meant for somebody specific?
Oh, sorry. I suppose anyone who's interested in taking it.
We can leave, or we can go.
Maybe because the mic is
Then
there.
we get the mic. Okay.
Logistically wise,
Yes, please. Yeah, ask it.
Hello, everyone. I would like to thank you for this opportunity to be part of this incredible discussion, especially because the table is predominantly made by women, so it's very important for us to discuss this with you. I would like to address one thing, because we discussed the issues that we face while we discuss about migrants and everything. And for me, a missing person is and was in love of someone. So how can you foster the awareness of these challenging points that made someone to migrate to the countries that receive the migrants? And how can we create like a more empathetic and informed society about how to engage and find solutions to support these affected people? Thank you.
So I will first mention one thing that is completely unrelated, but something that he said brought it to my mind, and I'm just happy to share. Completely unrelated, but today the working group itself started its session, and it's the first time in history that the working group is composed only of women. It's the first time it's 5 women groups, which is not... And I'm particularly happy about this because when I became a member, I know the story, I enter and very much, well, you will understand the style. I entered and I said, I have a dream. Today the dream is true, so now we are searching for a new dream, and here I already have ideas that we are going to pursue. But it's not just the gender issue per se and tick the box, it's 5 women. I do think this will give a different perspective, the way we look at the problem. And maybe this goes also towards the question I will answer in reverse order. To create a more empathetic or friendly environment. This goes back to where I started. For me, it's crucial to make visible families as such, because as long as you simply show the figure and say, okay, these are those dead or those missing, you are not seeing that there are families, that there are clans, that there are communities, that there are entire groups of people that are suffering, that are searching for their loved ones, and that are in need of responses. So I guess that there is a multi-layered approach to be undertaken, on the one hand by actors at the international level, to maybe contribute to enhance this visibility, but also civil society should maybe more active in creating this environment and in increasing this visibility and in giving them voices. I can think of the media, how they should cover these issues, maybe looking at it from a different angle. So I think the bad news there is that little so far has been done, in my view, or too little. But there are many things that can be done, which is the good news I see in this. Your question is very pertinent, but for me there are many layers of how to look at it. On the one hand, how to involve, how to hold them accountable, to which extent. And I do see at least 3 different angles. From the humanitarian perspective, how do you engage? Private sector is a big thing. So I do think there are actors with which is easier to engage from a humanitarian perspective, also asking them for information or for their intervention. There are other actors where it's simply impossible to engage, in particular from the international level. From the human rights perspective, I do think that there is a lot that is being done to engage with the private sector, establishing accountability and levels of accountability. I'll go back to my example of new technology and enforced disappearance. In the report that will be published, there is an entire section that goes directed with recommendations to tech companies. Not because they do disappear people, but because they do design tools that are actively used to disappear people, or they do not design things that can be used to facilitate the search. So there is an actor with which we've never engaged so far, but I do think something more can be done. So that's where I do think we can create more links, and we should create more links. The criminal and third aspect is where I do think there is more room for maneuver, well, I mean, with the difficulties we've seen before, but for example, failure to provide support or enter in a search and rescue situation, or withholding of information. There I do see it relatively easier to hold them to account, just out of experience. The difficulty I would see with the specific case of migrants is again back to the transnational dimension. So if you want to hold accountable a specific private actor in a country other than, and in which country would you act on this, applying which particular criminal system, that would be problematic, not impossible. But out of the 3 is the one where I think more could be done.
So just, I mostly want to respond to you, but just adding a short on that is that While there are different perceptions on perpetrators of enforced disappearances, because we have, at least we have the definition in international human rights law and in international criminal law, then we have a new interpretation by the committee on that. So there might be some things that fit or might not fit. I do not think that businesses would fit the perpetrators element in any of those broad perspectives. So even if you would find a responsibility of a business for a disappearance, then it would be kidnapping, extortion, forced labor, murder, things like that, and not enforced disappearance. I could really, even in my wildest dream, I cannot imagine a situation where I could stretch it that far. So that's, and as with regard to families, I'm actually totally on the same team as Gabriela in trying to make that really also at the center of the issue. And I think this has been done a bit better with regard to enforced disappearances so far, because this is one of the, or the only crime where families themselves are considered victims of the crime. So if you have an enforced disappearance, it's not only the forcibly disappeared person, but any person that has been directly affected by the disappearance is a victim of an enforced disappearance. So in that sense, the wife of the disappeared person, his or her children, could all be considered, are all considered to be victims of enforced disappearances. And, but this has taken years. So it's not like years ago that would not, but it is in a convention, it's really how they are perceived. And I think it shows that the international community, at least with regard to enforced disappearances, really has recognized that this disappearance of a person is such a deep pain for the families that they have to live with, that this is one of the forms of recognition. This has not been so far done with regard to missing migrants. So it is also different because with regard to enforced disappearances, it's actually the state is using enforced disappearances precisely because it does not only affect the disappeared person, but its community. So it might not aim only at the family, but at the neighbors, at the political party the person comes from, to keep them afraid. And this is, of course, different with regard to missing migrants. But it also, like the perception that we might have in society, a negative perception, for example, of irregular migrants, would also lead to not having more empathy for families of missing migrants. So I think, for me, like with regard to what should we change in the perspective of society, I think more empathy in general for people on the move would be the first step. Because if we consider people on the move to be criminals, then we will not feel empathy to their families. So I think for me that's a bit that way around, but I have seen actually some good, at least on an international level, some good trends. So the one of the main organization that keeps track of missing migrants is the IOM, and the numbers published by the IOM actually only are not missing migrants, it's dead migrants in certain circumstances, not even all dead migrants. But it's at least we have some numbers and we can see where things are happening. And initially, this IOM missing migrant project was concentrated only on the migrants. But the more they work, the more they realize that they actually do need to concentrate also on families. And last year, or the year before, quite recently, they published a really comprehensive report on needs of families of missing migrants. And they did a review of 4 different countries where they looked at the families, they spoke with families, and they published what their perception is, what their needs are, who they contact to find their loved ones. It's really interesting. In one of the countries, I think Ethiopia, the family said that they would be more likely to get in touch with the smugglers than with the officials, because the smugglers actually have more information. But I think those studies, and that they are published by the very Missing Migrants project that was created to keep count of deaths. And the fact that they actually do such a comprehensive study shows that there is will and recognition of this issue. I don't think it creates more empathy in society, but I think that at least we know we have something to relate to. And if you're interested in that topic, then those reports are, in my opinion, really good.
Perfect. Florian, do you wish to add something?
A very interesting question on the role of private actors. Don't have much to add to what was already said. One thing, connectivity. Yeah, connectivity is really key in preventing family separation along migratory routes, and this is often when people go missing. So maintaining connectivity is really a critical preventive issue. If I recall the Ukraine situation, I think there was literally companies queuing up to provide free SIM cards, etc. I can assure you this is not the case for irregular migrants, etc. So the reasons for it, etc. But I'm just saying, you know, if the private sector wants to play a role, they're very concrete things that could be done. It's obviously all related to empathy, right? So that's the second question. I do think, you know, as Gabriela said, raising awareness is absolutely critical, and numbers are part of this, but not everything. I think especially in Europe, but also in other parts of the world, there is kind of the principle of out of sight, out of mind. And I think that very concretely applies to missing migrants. And if you look at, you know, if you look at policy that push borders further away, that also has the effect of creating the distance between you and the problem. And so it's already, I think it's a very crass thing to say, but there's probably a difference of somebody drowning in the Mediterranean, at least in circumstances where events are documented, or somebody disappearing in the Sahara, where nobody's there to even witness it, right? So there are these really, I mean, there's the policy angle of pushing it back, which is problematic. But there's also the point of that we have vast white areas on the map of where people are going missing and how many and what is happening to them. I give you one example. It links back to something that IOM has done. They managed to position a question in a household, a national household survey in Ethiopia, where they added to a long questionnaire on all kinds of issues, one question on, in your household, has somebody gone missing in migration? And from the answers, they concluded that around 51,000 households in Ethiopia are missing someone in migration. That's one country, 51,000 households. The total number that IOM has counted since they started counting in 2014 is 55,000. So if you look at that, there's just one country that when you ask the families, it comes close to that number. The question is, where did they all go? And you have routes into Southern Africa, and you have routes across the Gulf of Aden, into Yemen, into the Gulf countries there. We have we have an idea that terrible things are happening, but we have no numbers. We have very little knowledge of what is happening. There's a lot of places in the world like this. And I think it's important to really document what's going on there and to make it known, so that there is no excuse for ignoring it.
I have a question regarding the impunity. I am from Greece, and I was working in Greece with refugees and migrants at the external borders, at the land borders and the sea borders. And in my personal view, it's a fact that the national authorities commit to forced disappearance, not only in Greece, but also in the Mediterranean countries as a part of the preventive policies regarding migration. And then my question is how civil society, how NGOs can actually initiate criminal proceedings against the state, or what can do in terms of impunity and rendering justice in the crime.
We have to bear in mind that at least when it comes to state responsibility, establishing it either before regional human rights courts or committees of the UN, there is a considerable number of cases that are pending, which means we have this talk in 1 year, this may change, and there are at least a couple of cases that fit what you described, that hopefully when the judgment on the one end or the views on the other will be delivered, will really pinpoint the state responsibility. So this is ongoing. Now, and here I take off my cap as Working group, this is strictly civil society. I do think that for this, there is a need to strategize. You can't bring all the cases, and this would make no sense. So you need to choose a good case, a very emblematic one, and to try and aim for a leading or a landmark judgment. That's why I'm quite positive that this might change quite very soon if those cases were well documented, as I know they were. The point and the game will be afterwards. You get a good judgment that establishes state responsibility. But then it goes back to the state to implement the judgment. And there is where I do think that civil society has to already think how to use wisely before domestic authorities those judgments or views or whatever you will obtain from the international level. So I do think the first chunk of the work is more or less done, but there is much more to be done in the near future.
And while I agree that a lot of practices at this particular part of Europe are enforced disappearances, I'm not sure whether the best way to challenge those policies is through calling them enforced disappearances, if there are other ways to do it. Because in that sense, to call them enforced disappearances, you need to make an argument that's very innovative and very new and kind of goes contrary to some other things. And it's actually, I'm confident that it's doctrinally possible to make that argument. But those practices also violate clearly so many other things, both domestic law and international. So I would probably go for the safer ones. So while keeping in mind that I actually think those are, some of those things are instances of enforced disappearances, I think strategically, I'm not sure that it's worth it, but we can disagree on that.
No. If I just may complement this, and well, I know that I'm opening Pandora's box here. To really qualify these cases as enforced disappearances, there are at least two elements where there is a difficulty with states. First of all, you do have to make the point that there is a deprivation of liberty. How far do we want to stretch that? When do we say there is a deprivation of liberty? And then there should be either an open denial that the person was held in detention or was deprived of liberty, or the concealment, an active concealment of the fate or whereabouts. In some cases, I do think you can make the cut and it's really clear cut. In some others, you need to go for a big stretch. And what she said, I think she was quoting something where I was questioning a discussion which we were having. I'm all for calling things by their name. But in some cases, we do not have to invest too many energies in really willing to call something enforced disappearance when we can call it whatever other name and it's already a human rights violation, instead of entering a minefield. So I just do think, and it goes back to strategizing, where do you want it, and what is the added value in some of these cases. But then you might wish to overstretch and reinterpret deprivation of liberty.
Yeah, and I mean, there is added value to it, including that only by calling those enforced disappearances, you have the families themselves to be considered victims. So this is definitely an issue, as long as you can prove those other elements. So this is, while I would go actually probably strategically for other things, unless there is a decision kind of for, especially for family reasons, to go for enforced disappearance. To me, that would be the main argument to try to make that an enforced disappearance argument. If again there was actually involvement of denial, then I think that's where you can make the easiest argument. But yeah, I'm not sure I'm that positive about the judgments being that good. I was recently mostly disappointed by judgments of the European Court of Human Rights. Okay, not the European Court. Okay, so Yeah, we're done. So I think it really depends. And one thing is that sometimes where there's even a really strong case, it gets a judgment that is super disappointing for some procedural or small reasons. So it's always difficult kind of to and especially in migration topics, particularly the European Court of Human Rights has been very conservative in, or differently, has been given very much freedom to states to conduct their policies. And this is clear among many different views. So kind of in that sense, and this is the first step, and then the next step is then what do states do with those judgments? Like what, and even if you have a violation judgment, it might be so narrow to this specific case that it might in the end not be useful strategically. So in that sense, I think there is still a lot to be done. And personally, I think that policies will, at least in Europe, I don't think they will be changed by court judgments. I think they might change through civil society and other efforts, but I don't think it's the courts that's going to change. And the problem that that Greece is having at the border is not stemming from courts. It's stemming from policies that not only Greece accepts, but the European Union as an entirety. So I think that's also kind of thinking about where these policies come from. Like, and I think that's also a way to think about how that can change.
I just had a very quick question because I was very interested by the fact of what you said that also families are considered to be victims. I hadn't heard that before, and I thought that was very interesting. And I was just wondering where are the boundaries in that sense, because I imagine in the sense of like your nephew, your third line cousin, just like, is there some kind of like standard in that regard? Just very quick question. Thank you.
Okay, I will try to be very short. It's actually, the response to this question would be very wide, but the conventional definition is direct, that was directly affected by the enforced disappearance. So in that sense, it's not family members. It's if you... Exactly. It's if it's your roommate that was directly affected by the enforced disappearance, it's also a direct victim. But if your father had no contact with you over the last 10 years, then he would likely not be a direct victim. So that's the conventional definition. And then you would have regional courts that apply it a bit differently. So you would have the European Court of Human Rights that's very strict, and for example would not address children born after the father disappeared, or young children very often, which is very different to the Inter-American Court that would accept that children that were raised in a household where somebody has disappeared before they were born are deeply affected and also victim of enforced disappearances. And then you have the Human Rights Committee that's a bit in between and different, but kind of you have different aspects of that. There are not many cases where nephews would be found, but they are. So that's kind of bottom line to the question.
I mean, if you want to go for the broader standard, that's the Inter-American one. Yeah. And there you would have cases where it goes to people who were not even born when the disappearance took place, because it looks into the intergenerational effects of an enforced disappearance. And what is most interesting is that they shift the burden of proof. So they take it for granted that the family, in the Latin American sense of family, la familia, big thing, okay? So it's the nephew up to the nephew and to the friends and to the, they are all victims. And they apply a presumption. And then it's up for the state. If the states want to challenge this and say, no, indeed, this person didn't even met and they were not proactive and there is no direct harm, welcome. But otherwise, that wouldn't be the case. The European Court of Human Rights says, well, as I said, it doesn't exist. So.
Yeah, but I think the most important thing is that's a direct victim. So it's kind of that there was some, and in that sense, when you take the conventional definition, it's everyone affected, directly affected by. And I actually really like this form because it leaves it open, but it's also about really the impact. It's not about the relationship to that person, but it's the impact of the disappearance on the person.
Yeah, if I may, because it's something on no, I'll be quick because she's quoting an article of in the International Convention for the Protection of All Persons from Enforced Disappearance, which is, for knowledge, Article 24, Paragraph 1, that basically enshrines all the jurisprudence from the years before. Now, When that article was discussed, there was a proposal that was even broader because it refers actually to persons who have suffered a direct harm as a result of an enforced disappearance. The broader proposal on the table was not only person, meaning physical person, but also organizations or associations. What was the purpose of this? Think of when you have a trade unionist that is disappeared. Is the whole trade union as such that is actually affected? Think of a journalist, then there is a damage that goes beyond specific persons. During the negotiations, this, let's say, collective aspect was lost, and they went for this person affected. It would still allow to cover the broader effect, the ripple effect I was referring to earlier, but there is no reference to the, let's say, organizational or association effect. There is something on which jurisprudence is not broad yet, but I think one day should be covered, is where the enforced disappearance concerns indigenous persons, because there the collective damage is even broader, and the kind of collective impact should be very much studied as such.
You were brief. You were brief. Florian, if you have nothing pressing, do you have something to add on this? Okay, no? Okay, perfect, thank you. Well, with this, I really conclude this IHL talk. I mean, I can say it. I think you know it. I've told you this was my dream team panel. So I'm very glad that we've concluded this academic year with like so distinguished panelists who I really also consider them the experts on the topic, but people with huge heart and commitment to what they do. So thank you for coming, thank you for listening, and well, I hope you enjoy it. Thanks also, of course, to the panelists.